In my 17 years keeping fish, making mistakes and learning from them has been one of the biggest ways that I've grown as a fish keeper. In this video, I'll share some of the biggest mistakes I've run into so you can learn from them rather than committing them yourself. Probably the nightmare scenario that goes through every fish keeper's head, especially if they have expensive fish, is a heater cooking their fish. Now, if you're new to aquariums, you might not even be aware of this, but aquarium heaters have a tendency to be the component of every setup that breaks first. And usually what happens is your aquarium heater gets stuck on and continues heating past the level that you want your aquarium temperature to be at until it's so hot that it's killed all the fish in your aquarium. I've had this happen at least once that I can remember, but I think a number of other times I've caught it just before it was able to kill my fish. It's kind of crazy to me that I haven't done something about this, but all my aquariums still run on regular heaters. I'm relying on their thermostats to stay accurate, but I did recently buy a laser thermometer, which will allow me to regularly check their temperature, just to make sure that if an aquarium does start to get out of whack in terms of heat, I'm able to correct the problem before my fish are dead. Probably a better solution to the problem would be to get some kind of external heater controller, which will monitor the temperature of the water independently from your actual aquarium heater and make sure that it only turns on when heat is needed. Unfortunately, there's no huge solution to this problem, but I definitely thought it was worth mentioning because I feel like it's one of the biggest nightmares that almost anyone who's kept a lot of aquariums has had to deal with, because for whatever reason, the aquarium industry cannot make a heater that doesn't fail. A lot of people think that keeping aquariums is very difficult, and in some ways it is, but it's about discipline and about doing the little things every day to avoid the big problems that pile up when this complacency sets in. Things like testing your water regularly, doing your water changes when they're needed, feeding your fish every day, taking a few minutes every day to watch your fish and make sure they're healthy. These seem like really simple things, but if you're not actively checking those boxes off on a daily or weekly basis, depending on the task, it can build up into a serious problem where all of a sudden you have a pH crash that kills all your fish, or one of your fish starves to death. There are so many different problems that the real solution to them with aquariums is keeping your eye on them every day and playing an active and proactive role in testing your water and staying on top of it. And I think this is an issue for everyone because as you get more into keeping fish, you'll start to accumulate more aquariums, and as you expand the number you have, you may be really passionate about your aquariums, but in my case with 15 aquariums, it's hard to motivate myself to test the pH of 15 aquariums even once a week. That feels like a lot of work, and I'm guilty of making this mistake too. But the number one key to avoiding mistakes is avoiding complacency and staying on top of the day-to-day things that you need to do to keep your aquarium healthy. Another serious mistake that a lot of people make, and this happens both for beginners and experienced fish keepers, is the acclimation process when you bring in new fish. Now, people have different opinions on this process, but I've done a lot of research, and a number of industry experts all believe that plop and drop is the best method of acclimation. Now, I did a whole video describing how this works, but essentially all you do when you bring your fish home is float the bag for 30 minutes until the temperature matches between the water in the bag and the water in your tank. Open the bag, pour it through a net into a bucket or something where the water won't enter your aquarium, and then introduce the fish to your aquarium. I'm not going to go heavily into why other methods don't work as well, but things like drip acclimation seem logical, but when you look into the science of what happens when you're mixing two very different waters together, it really just costs you a lot of time and may actually kill your fish while you're acclimating them, when your intention is to give them the most peaceful introduction to their tank as possible. The next mistake is something I'm really guilty of, and that is not quarantining. Quarantining your fish is a really important thing to do because it protects all the fish you already have from being introduced to new diseases or parasites from whatever fish you bring in. So what I should do, and what I recommend you do, is get a 10-gallon tank that you set aside and it's dedicated to being your quarantine tank. So set it up, and anytime you get new fish, acclimate them to the quarantine tank and watch them for 1 to 2 weeks. Now, if you want to be really proactive, and ideally what I'd say you do is treat them with 3 medications, which are Maricin, Paraclens, and Icex. Now, this is a med trio that Aquarium Co-op, one of my favorite YouTube channels, recommends. You put those 3 meds in, treat for 1 10-gallon dose, let it sit for a week, and just watch the fish. Don't feed that much, and try to see if any problems present themselves. If after a week everything seems fine, I think you're totally safe to put them into your tank. There is a slight possibility of carrying internal parasites, which Paraclens is used to treat. And if you want to be extremely safe, maybe you have some really expensive fish already in your display tank that you're worried about infecting, you could go through a full round of 2 or 3 full treatments of Paraclens just to make sure the parasites get out. And you're still at times going to run into diseases that get brought into your tank, and it's hard to recognize what the origin is. But using a quarantine tank is a really good way to avoid some major outbreaks, which I had one 55-gallon tank where I wiped out, I think, more than 30 neon tetras overnight because they got ick, and I panicked and treated with a medicine that I'd never used before, where if you're ready with your medications and you treat your fish before they enter your main tank, you're going to protect yourself from losing fish you already have, and you're going to give your new fish their best chance at survival. This next mistake is kind of unique because there's no real way that I can teach you exactly how to avoid it, and it's overfeeding and underfeeding. Now, I think most people expect that new fish keepers, if they're going to make a mistake, it's going to be putting too much food in the tank. And that can absolutely be an issue that can wipe out a lot of your fish. So you need to make sure, especially when you're starting a new tank, that you gradually increase the amount of food you feed, because if you put in a bunch of food all at once the first time you ever feed, your tank isn't going to be prepared to process that much waste efficiently, and it could easily wipe out your whole tank when you've just started it. Now, underfeeding is a slightly different issue, and this is hard to notice, and I think I am at times guilty of it. Now, some fish eat a lot more than other types of fish. Bristlenose plecostomus are one of my favorite fish to keep and breed, and they eat a lot. So it's really challenging to walk the line between avoiding feeding too much to foul the water too fast and avoiding feeding too little to the point where their stomachs are sunken in and they're not getting the nutrition that they need. So really, this issue is best solved by observing your fish regularly and just trying to get an idea of how much food they eagerly eat before they sort of calm down and stop actively foraging as much. Some fish will eat so much that they could die if you allow them access to that much food. Guppies are one example of this. But it's really challenging for me to give you an exact solution to this problem, but with overfeeding and underfeeding, it's really important that you just observe your fish at the beginning, slowly increase the amount of food you're feeding, and once you've reached that amount, continue to observe to make sure that your fish haven't multiplied or grown to a point where they need even more food, because underfeeding could also lead to deaths or malnutrition for your fish. Algae blooms are a huge issue that causes a lot of people to quit the hobby before they even start. I've had a lot of issues with it in the past, and I've been lucky recently to not run into any more because I have not been on top of the photo period of my aquariums. Now, the mistake I think a lot of people make is that they think, I'll turn the lights on when I wake up in the morning, leave them on all day, and turn them off right before I go to bed. And I'll admit, I usually do this because I love looking at my fish and I want to be able to whenever I want to. But if you think about the light cycle in the wild, there's really probably only an average of 8 to 12 hours of daylight a day. So anything above that is really unnecessary for your aquarium. And if you're having algae problems or things like that, putting your lights on some sort of timer, maybe a smart timer like Casa Wi-Fi timers, would be a great way to limit the amount of light going into your aquarium. And I think a lot of times this can be a quick fix for algae problems because people don't think about the logic of, in the wild, this is how much light my aquarium would get, versus in my house, oh, I'm giving it almost twice the amount of light it would receive in nature. So I think it's really important that if you're having these algae problems, don't get discouraged. Shorten your lighting period and see if that helps. And if you're really still having problems with algae, reach out online. There are forums and YouTube videos dedicated to how to get rid of algae. I really hope that you don't give up on keeping fish because of algae problems, because once you get past them, you get to all the fun parts of keeping fish, and it's really just a problem that's annoying and we've all dealt with it, but once you get past it, there's so many fun things to come. This next mistake is one of the most avoidable mistakes that I think tons of people are guilty of. I was watching a video from Keeping Fish Simple the other day, and he mentioned that he killed some of his zebra plecostomus because he didn't dechlorinate the water before he introduced it to his tank after a water change. I've done this also. I'm glad that I didn't do it with a fish as expensive as that, but dechlorinating your water is a huge box to check just to make sure that you're avoiding disaster in your aquariums. I had a 20-gallon high. It was actually the same tank that you see up here. It previously had a community pack of guppies in it, just sort of mixed coloration, that I was keeping at school. And all of my aquarium stuff was at home, so I had to buy new supplies, and I neglected to buy dechlorinator. And I figured, oh, I haven't used dechlorinator in a long time. It'll be fine. And then one day I did a water change, probably a 25 or 30% water change, and came back to every adult guppy dead and all but 2 or so of the baby guppies also dead. Now, guppies aren't the hardiest fish ever, but it was extremely evident that there was an issue with the water I introduced that likely could have been avoided by using dechlorinator. So if you're not using dechlorinator now, you may think nothing bad has happened, maybe I don't need it, but I would highly recommend you just use it as a precaution, because you never know when your municipal water supply may have extra chlorine introduced, or there may be some other pollutant introduced to it that they don't notify you of. And I think it's just a really good insurance policy to always dechlorinate your water. I like to use either Prime or Fritz dechlorinator, but I really think any dechlorinator works. I'm pretty sure all of them use the exact same chemical compound. So go pick yourself up a dechlorinator if you don't have one already, because you could save the lives of your fish. Breeding too many of a fish is probably the #1 mistake that I've made multiple times over. And I've done this with common bristlenose plecostomus. I'm most recently dealing with it with silver angelfish. And The real problem here is it all depends on what your goals are with breeding your fish, but if you plan on selling your fish, you really need to have a concrete plan of who you're going to sell the fish to before you even start breeding them. Because once you amass a significant number of fish and they're getting bigger every day, the amount of food you're going to have to feed them exponentially increases, and that's becoming an exponential load on your expenses and your budget for buying more fish food. And as these fish get bigger, if you have no one to sell them to, as bad as it sounds, you almost come to resent these fish because they're kind of an anchor on your ability to progress your hobby more, because you have to find something to do with them. So despite the fact that I continue to make this mistake, I highly recommend that you're careful with what you start breeding. You make sure there's a market to either sell it or give it away before you start breeding a fish, because if you don't want endless amounts of food going towards a fish that you're never going to make any money off of, you're going to want to be proactive and try to avoid this issue. A small but easily avoidable mistake that I felt I had to include was including a top or lid on your aquarium. Now, not all fish are as guilty of jumping as others, but some fish I've kept, like for instance swordtails and hatchet fish, are extremely prone to jumping out of the tank. If you kept them without a lid, I would almost guarantee you that at some point you're going to lose some, if not all of them, to jumping, because nothing sucks more than walking up to your tank and finding a fish dried up on the floor, and that's a mistake that can easily be avoided. You can DIY your own lids out of greenhouse siding. You can buy glass lids from either your local Petco, PetSmart, or possibly your local retailer as well. If you have neither of those options, you could even do something as simple as laying a blanket over your tank or something like that. I've used a towel before. They do get kind of wet from the evaporation, but at least you'll avoid your fish jumping out of your tank. That might be a good solution temporarily until you're able to purchase a lid. But regardless of how you do it, highly recommend that every tank you have has a lid on it. It'll keep your fish from jumping. It will make it easier to heat your aquarium to the temperature it needs, and it'll minimize evaporation so you won't have to top off your aquarium as frequently. The overarching mistake that I think everyone makes, and at sometimes this is acceptable, but you need to be aware of it, is dividing your attention. Now, the more aquariums you get and the more into this hobby you become, the more challenging it becomes to dedicate the proper amount of time to each aquarium and making sure that your fish are healthy throughout this ever-expanding collection of fish that you have. And this kind of goes back to the first point I made about complacency. You have to find a balance between keeping enough fish that you're passionate and excited frequently about what's going on with your aquariums, but also you've ratcheted down the number enough so that you're able to actually keep them all in the best conditions possible, because you have to remember these are live animals, and in my opinion, obviously it's harder to feel as sad about a fish dying as like your dog dying, but you really want to dedicate as much effort to keeping these fish alive as healthy as you would any other pet. And they are easier than a lot of pets, but they still require work, and you have to be willing to put in that work. And the more fish you get, the more work you're building for yourself. And prior to expanding to some significant multitude of aquariums, you need to make sure, do I truly have enough time to do this right and to keep these fish the way they're supposed to be kept and as healthy as they can be? If you want more guidance from my experience keeping fish, check out this video on 10 secrets I've learned about fish keeping in my 17 years doing it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.